The lawyer clears his throat at 10:14 in the morning, and Lily Yuen knows, before he speaks, that what he is about to read will not mention her name. She has been sitting in the corner chair of Feldman and Associates conference room for 20 minutes. Having arrived early because arriving early is the habit of someone who spent 15 years making herself useful enough to justify her presence, and in those 20 minutes she has watched her step-uncle Gerald Hargreaves arrange himself at the head of the table with the specific proprietary ease of a man who already knows what a room contains and considers it his. His wife Diane sits beside him, her expression the particular composition of controlled satisfaction that wealth anticipates rather than receives. Their son Brendan, 31, has positioned himself near the window in a studied casualness that Lily recognizes as performance. Because Brendan has been performing casualness around her since he was 14, and she was 16, and she moved into the Hargreaves house on Meridian Lane with a suitcase and a backpack and her mother's hand firm on her shoulder. She had been 16. Her mother, Helen, had married Robert Hargreaves, Gerald's older brother, 6 months after Robert and Helen met at a benefit dinner for a children's hospital, a meeting that had seemed, to both of them, like the specific late-arriving grace of people who had been through enough difficulty to recognize kindness when it appeared. What neither of them had fully mapped, in the specific hopefulness of new love at 53 and 58 respectively, was how the arrival of a stepchild into the Hargreaves family would land with the rest of the Hargreaves family. It had landed poorly. Lily is 31 years old now, and she is sitting in the corner chair of a conference room because the will being read today belongs to Robert and Margaret Hargreaves, Robert's parents, who died within 3 months of each other this winter, first Margaret at 83 and then Robert's father Edward at 86. As people who have been married for 61 years sometimes do when one goes and the other cannot locate the reason to remain. And Lily has been included in the notification to attend, which is unusual enough that she has spent the 2 weeks since receiving the letter constructing quiet hypotheses about why. Martin Feldman opens the folder. "I'll read the primary document first," he says. And then there's a supplementary instrument that the Hargreaveses asked be read immediately following. The second document was prepared separately and held in this office in a sealed envelope for the past 11 years. The instructions were explicit that it be read in the presence of all named parties at the same session as the primary will. Gerald Hargreaves shifts slightly in his chair. It is a small shift. Lily notices it. She notices everything. 15 years has made noticing everything both survival skill and second nature. Martin Feldman begins to read. The exclusion was not dramatic. This is the first thing that needs to be said about it because dramatic exclusion is something a person can confront, can name, can build a case against in the specific internal tribunal that children hold about the adults in their lives. What the Hargreaves house offered was something considerably more difficult to prosecute. The specific, daily, deniable form of being treated as a guest in someone else's home rather than a member of someone else's family. She was not mistreated. She was not abused. She was fed and housed and educated, and the house on Meridian Lane was large enough that her room was comfortable and private, and Robert Hargreaves tried, with the specific limited tools available to a man of his formation, to make her welcome. What the rest of the Hargreaves family offered was the awareness, communicated through 10,000 small signals across 15 years, that she was adjacent to the family rather than part of it. She had been 16 when she learned to do Robert and Margaret's grocery shopping, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had understood, with the specific survival intelligence of a teenager working out the terms of her accommodation, that being useful was the most defensible form of belonging available to her. She had been 18 when Margaret Hargreaves said to her at a family dinner, "You're very efficient, Lily, very capable." It was the closest thing to a compliment Margaret Hargreaves had ever offered her, and Lily had turned it over in her mind for 3 days before understanding that efficiency and capability were the qualities Margaret Hargreaves valued in staff. She had been 22 when she left for university on a scholarship she had earned herself, with the specific relief of someone who has survived an extended test of something and is grateful to be done with it. She had been 24 when her mother Helen died. a stroke fast, in the way that is merciful for the person and catastrophic for the people who love them, and Lily had returned to the Hargreaves house for the funeral and stood in the kitchen afterward, listening to the extended family discuss Robert's grief with the specific concern of people who considered his grief theirs to manage, and had understood that her own grief, for her own mother, was outside the frame of what the room considered relevant. She had been 28 when Robert died, cancer 2 years, and she had been there at the end in the hospital because she was the one who answered the phone when the hospital called and who drove from her apartment and who sat with him through the last 3 days while Gerald and Diane managed the logistics from a comfortable distance and Brendan sent flowers. Robert had held her hand at the end and said, "I'm sorry I wasn't better at this." She had said, "You tried. That counts." She had driven home. She had cried in her car for 45 minutes. She had gone upstairs and made herself dinner and returned to her life, which is what you do. The primary will of Robert Hargreaves and Margaret Hargreaves is, in its distribution of assets, exactly what Gerald Hargreaves' settled ease at the head of the table predicted. The estate passes to the surviving family in proportions that reflect 60 years of the Hargreaves family's internal understanding of itself. Gerald receives 40%. There are bequests to cousins. There is a charitable provision. Lily's name does not appear. Gerald Hargreaves says, "What does that mean?" When Martin Feldman describes the supplementary instrument, Martin Feldman opens the sealed envelope. He removes a document. He reads quietly for a moment before he speaks, and in that moment Lily watches Gerald Hargreaves watch Martin Feldman, and she watches the specific quality of Gerald Hargreaves' attention shift from proprietary ease to something that has a different texture. "It means," Martin Feldman says, "that I'm going to need everyone to listen carefully." What Margaret Hargreaves knew and had known for 23 years, since the year Lily was 8 years old and living in a different city with her mother Helen and had never heard the name Hargreaves, was this: Edward Hargreaves, her husband of 61 years, was Lily Yuen's biological grandfather. The specific circumstances: Edward Hargreaves had, in 1978, a relationship with a woman named Susan Chun, who was 24 and working as a research assistant at the university where Edward was a tenured professor of economics. The relationship lasted 8 months. It ended when Susan Chun understood that Edward Hargreaves' commitment to his family was not something his feelings for her were going to displace. Susan Chun had been pregnant when the relationship ended. She did not tell Edward. She raised her daughter alone, and her daughter, Helen Chun, who would become Helen Yuen upon her marriage to James Yuen, grew up knowing that her father was a man her mother described only as "someone I knew briefly, before you." Margaret Hargreaves had put these pieces together in the second year of Helen and Robert's marriage, when she was at a family gathering and looked across a room at Lily Yuen, 16 years old, dark-haired, with a specific habit of observational stillness, and recognized something in the geometry of her face that she recognized from photographs. Not Robert's face, not Gerald's face, the face of a young woman she had seen in photographs that she had found, 20 years earlier, in a box in her attic that belonged to her husband. She had worked it out across 23 years, which is a long time to hold something, and she had arrived, eventually, at the conclusion that it could not remain nothing indefinitely, but that the correct vehicle for ending the nothing was not a confrontation in her lifetime but a document in her estate, which would ensure that the information arrived with legal weight rather than personal drama, and with the specific, incontrovertible finality that a notarized instrument in the hands of a trusted attorney conveys in a way that a conversation never quite can. She had prepared the supplementary instrument 11 years ago, when she was 72. The letter begins, "Dear Lily, you were never what we made you feel you were. I am sorry it took me this long to find the right way to tell you." The supplementary instrument establishes, with supporting DNA documentation that Margaret had arranged and the attorney had notarized 11 years ago, that Lily Yuen is the biological granddaughter of Edward Hargreaves, and therefore entitled to an equal share of the Hargreaves estate, a provision that Margaret had structured with the specific purpose of ensuring it was not merely symbolic but materially and legally operative. The room, when Martin Feldman finishes reading, is very quiet. Gerald Hargreaves's expression is the specific composition of a man who has just had the floor of a room he considered his demonstrate that it was not as solid as he believed. Martin Feldman gives her the letter in a small conference room down the hall, alone, with a glass of water she does not drink and the door closed, and she reads it twice. Once fast, the way you read things you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting, and once slowly, giving each paragraph the weight it has earned across 23 years of Margaret Hargreaves's consideration. The letter covers 4 things: the acknowledgement of Edward's relationship with Susan Chun, the recognition of what Margaret saw when Lily arrived at 16, the accounting of how Margaret had observed the family's treatment of Lily and her own role in allowing it to pass without intervention, and the instruction, not legal but personal. Please try not to become a person whose life is organized around having been wronged, because you are more than the wrong that was done to you, and the wrong that was done to you was done by people who were, in various ways, not fully themselves in the doing of it. This is not the same as saying it didn't happen. It happened. I know it happened. The letter you are holding is the proof that I knew it happened and that I have been sorry about my part in it for 23 years. You were never what we made you feel you were. You were always one of us. I am sorry it took me this long and this vehicle to say so. Lily Yuen sits in the small conference room for a long time after she finishes the letter. Then she folds it carefully along its original creases and puts it in her jacket pocket, where she will carry it for the next several months. 3 weeks after the reading of the will, during the estate inventory, Lily finds in Edward Hargreaves's private study, in the back of the bottom drawer of his desk, a shoebox taped closed with nothing written on the outside. Inside, 41 letters and 3 photographs. The letters span 1979 to 1981. Difficult correspondence from Susan Chun in the aftermath of the relationship. But in 1994, a letter different in character from the others. Formal, not personal, informing Edward Hargreaves that Susan Chun had been diagnosed with breast cancer, that her prognosis was uncertain, and that she felt he should know that the daughter she had not told him about 15 years earlier had grown up and was a healthy and remarkable young woman named Helen, who had her own daughter, Lily, who was now 3 years old. The letter concludes, "I am not writing to ask you for anything. I am writing because I thought you should know that what happened between us produced a life, and then 2 lives, and that those lives are well. I leave the rest to you." There are 2 more letters from 1994, and then nothing until 2001. 7 years of silence, during which Edward Hargreaves apparently did nothing with the information Susan Chun had given him, and during which Helen became a widow and raised Lily alone, all unknown to Edward, who knew her name and nothing else. Lily sits with this for a long time in Edward Hargreaves's study. She thinks about her mother, who never knew. She thinks about the 23 years of knowing and not telling. What Lily holds is the knowledge that Edward Hargreaves, in 1994, learned that he had a daughter, her mother Helen, and did nothing. That 2 years later, Helen met Robert Hargreaves and began the relationship that would become a marriage, and that at some point, Robert mentioned to his parents that the woman he was seeing had a daughter and a complicated history, and that Edward Hargreaves, sitting with the knowledge he had been carrying since 1994, had said nothing. Had said nothing when his son married the daughter of the woman he had known. Had said nothing when Lily moved into the Hargreaves house. Had said nothing for the 23 years between 1994 and his death at 86, except to his wife, whom he must have told at some point because Margaret's supplementary instrument demonstrates that Margaret knew. Margaret had not chosen the document as a vehicle because it was the most elegant solution. She had chosen it because it was the only solution that could operate after Edward's death, when the specific complicated weight of Edward's knowing and not telling was no longer something anyone had to manage around. Margaret had been waiting for Edward to die so that she could tell the truth. What Lily Yuen does with what she knows is not confrontation, the deployment of the box's contents as additional leverage in the estate proceedings. She could do this. She has thought about it with the specific analytic patience of someone who was taught by 15 years of survival to think through the full consequences of available actions before choosing one. She chooses not to, not because the choice to disclose would be wrong. She chooses not to because of the instruction in Margaret's letter, which she has read 11 times. Please try not to become a person whose life is organized around having been wronged. She calls Gerald Hargreaves on a Tuesday afternoon. I want to tell you something, she says. And then I want to not discuss it again unless you need to. There's more in your parents' house than what the estate attorney knows about. In Edward's study. I found it during the inventory. I've documented it and I have it in safekeeping. I'm not going to use it in the estate proceedings. I'm telling you it exists because you deserve to know it exists, and because I've decided that what I want from your family is not more damage. I've had enough of that. I'd like, if it's possible, to figure out what a different kind of relationship looks like. Gerald Hargreaves is quiet for a long time. What's in the study? Letters. From before your brother married my mother. From before I was born. Things your father knew and chose not to tell. She pauses. Things your mother knew how to handle better than your father did. I didn't know, Gerald says, and his voice, for the first time in 31 years of Lily's acquaintance with it, sounds like the voice of someone who is not managing a position but simply speaking. I know you didn't, Lily says. Neither did I. Neither did my mother. But Margaret did. And Margaret, in the end, is the one who made sure it wasn't buried with her. Brendan calls her in the second month after the estate concludes. I wanted to say something. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for a while. Go ahead, she says. I was a shit to you, he says. When we were kids. I knew it at the time and I didn't do anything about it, and I've been thinking about it since the reading of the will, and I wanted to say it directly. Yes, she says. You were. I know, he says. I'm sorry. She holds this for a moment. Thank you, she says, for saying it directly. They talk for another 15 minutes, not warmly, not as though 15 years of small exclusions have been erased, because they have not been erased and Lily has no interest in pretending they have, but with the specific quality of two people who are trying to find out what a different kind of relationship looks like when the foundation of the old one has been rearranged by a fact nobody knew. She does not know whether this will become something. She has decided to allow it to become whatever it is capable of becoming, which is the most honest position available to her, and also, she is finding the most sustainable one. 8 months after the reading of the will, Lily Yuen is on a site visit for a project that she has designed for a family in the northern suburbs. A garden in memory of a parent who died last year, with a specific relationship between the visible and the hidden. She is walking the site with the family's adult daughter, explaining how the design works, how the path through the garden reveals its elements sequentially, so that you do not see the whole at once but encounter each part in the order that makes the whole meaningful, and how the elements that are most significant are placed not at the entrance but deeper in, where the person walking has to have made the commitment to go further before they become visible. Why not put the important things first? The daughter asks. Lily thinks about this. Because things that arrive too early don't always have the weight they're supposed to have, she says. Sometimes you need to have walked through what came before them to understand what they mean. The daughter looks at the site plan. And the things at the center. The ones you have to go deepest to reach. Yes, Lily says. Are those the most important? Lily looks at the site, at the space that is, right now, just cleared ground and possibility, the specific blank patience of a place that is about to become something it was not before. They're the ones, she says. That makes sense of everything you passed on the way there.